what we've done here is we've popped all the staples and gotten all the glue blocks out there and gave it a rough sanding. And when I say rough sanding, we used 80 grit paper. And so let me give you a couple of tips here. When you go to get your staples out, if you've got some diagonal cutters with a nice good sharp point there, you can just hold it, stick it down, grab it, pop it right out. They'll come out real quick, real easy. The blocks, I gave you a preview on that earlier. The safest way is to heat them up and pull them off. What I like to do, but you gotta be careful, is just to take a chisel, put it halfway on the block and pop it. And half of the block will come off. That'll make it easier to heat up. Now you can, if you want, take the chisel and chisel them off. You just gotta be really careful that you don't get overly aggressive and start pulling chunks of the boat off, right? So the safest way is to definitely use the heat gun, but you can also pop half the block off, and that's just take your chisel, nice sharp chisel, put it halfway down the block, give it a pop, and it'll pop right off for you. All right, then a little bit of heat and it'll come off. So, you know, this is the amount of 80 grit paper that we used to get the boat looking like this. And that was with scraping as much of the glue off, the hot glue off, as we could first, right? Because that glue is going to gum up your paper so that it looks like that. And the more glue on the boat, the more of this you're going to use, the longer it's going to take. And you know, you just don't like to have 80 grit paper going all over your boat for long, long periods of time. So take a little time, take nice sharp chisels, scrape the glue off. You'll get 90% of it off that way, and the rest of it you'll just take off with your paper. Just be ready to change your paper regularly. There's probably, I'm going to say 15 pieces of paper here, and that's just for a 10-foot boat. Okay? Okay, so once you get it to this level, I call this a rough sanding because this is not done yet, right? But you can see the hull looks great. There's a couple of spots here that we're going to have to fill, and we'll go over that in a little bit. But first, what we want to do is we want to get the hull to the position where we're ready to do our final sanding. So with the 80 grit paper, we basically got it down to a nice round, smooth shape, right? And now what we're going to do is we're going to take some hot water, not boiling hot, but just, you know, hot from the tap, with a rag, and we're going to wet the entire hull down. And what we're doing here is we're raising the grain so that all these little tiny staple holes will close right up for you. Any places where there are gaps, they'll close up as much as possible. Some of them completely, some of them not so much. And the other thing is, for the first time, you'll get a look at what your boat's going to look like once it's finished with glass on it. And you can see it's really beautiful. I mean, cedar makes a beautiful boat. All right, so when we're done doing this and it's all dry, we've given it a day to dry up, then we're going to come back and we're going to fill all the little holes that are left. And when I say fill, I mean, you know, there are going to be some places where your strips maybe weren't quite as tight as they could have been. I can see places here where we rushed along trying to move the DVD along and the strips aren't quite as tight as they should have been. And we're going to go ahead and make sure the stems are full and basically just use thickened epoxy to take care of all those little areas that weren't quite as good as they could have been. All right, so first I'm going to do this, let it sit, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to fill all those little irritating spaces that we got here. Well, the boat's dry and the grain on the boat raised nicely, so we're ready to proceed to the next step. Next step is we're going to fill all the little gaps that may have happened, right? So I may have a dozen of them on this boat. You're probably going to have some on your boat as well. And at the same time, we're going to go ahead and attach the stems, the outer stems to the boat. So we've already dry fitted these, and this is a step that you're going to do. And by dry fitting, all you do is you cut off the excess that you have from here forward, right? Because we already discussed basically how they go on the boat. So you cut off the excess, and what I do is I countersink every 6 inches. I start about an inch in, and then every 6 inches after that, I go down and I countersink, and I use deck screws and I just screw it down. Make sure that it's dead center, okay? Now, and be sure you countersink it because now's a really horrible time to crack it. And remember, when you're putting this on, just snug. It doesn't have to be cranked down, you're just snugging it up. Okay, so now that I've got this dry fitted, I can see that there's just a little bit of overhang, right? Now this is a 3/4 inch piece, and the stem, if you did it right, in the middle was a 1/4 of an inch, and you got 1/4 inch strips coming in on each side. So 3/4 inch is gonna be about right. Now, you know, boats don't go together perfectly. Now, it shouldn't go beneath 3/4. If it goes beneath 3/4 of an inch on the hull itself, then something's probably wrong, and you need to probably back all this out and sand it down, because as you sand it down, it'll widen out. Okay, but there may be some spots where it's just over 3/4 of an inch. And how does that happen? Well, you know, when you're beveling your inner stem, it might not be exactly perfect, and that bevel angle might be a little bit wrong, so your strips they'll spring out just a little bit. All right, so I got about a 1/16 of an inch here, I got about a 1/16 of an inch here. So all I do is after I dry fit, I take a pencil and I just make a mark all the way down on both sides. And then I'm gonna pull this off, and you're gonna see that mark. All right, so as I swing this out of the way, you can see the pencil mark going right down the sides here. Okay, and you can actually see where I had a little gap there. My stem was just a little bit wrong. So I got a little bit of a overhang on the hull itself here. So now I'm just going to take a sander, because it's easier to sand this down without this in the way. So I'm going to take my sander and I'm going to sand all the way down to the line on both sides of this, so that when I pull this back, it'll be a nice perfect fit. Okay, and once I've done that, then I'm just going to go ahead and fill all these little gaps. I'm going to mix up a little bit of epoxy with some filler, the same stuff I'm using to fill the gaps. I'm going to put it down here and on the back side of this. We're going to screw this back down using the same screws that we have here, the deck screws. And then when that dries, that'll be permanently attached to your hull. All right, now deck screws, because you're going to be backing them out, right? I never ever leave fasteners in a boat that you don't need. And the fact is, the only reason I'm using screws is to give basically a clamping pressure for the epoxy that gets set. All right, so once the epoxy is set, all the screws get backed out. And then at the end of that, you've got a choice to make, and we'll do this. We'll actually shape the stem. I like my stems to come to a point, or a slightly rounded over point. Some people like them hefty and wider like this. It's really up to you. It doesn't really matter to me. But then you're going to have to decide, you know, I typically drill these out and I will put bungs in them. And you can do that either with a darker wood like a mahogany or a sapelli, or you can stick to the same wood that this is, so that it all just kind of disappears and you have this magical piece of wood sticking to your boat. Now, we also thought about it here, and again, the objective of this boat was to show you all the tricks that I could figure out to show you. So I intentionally cut the other end so that this cut was too far back to show you how you deal with it when it gets wide. So let's take a look at the other end of the boat and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So down here, and I told you that if you make this cut too far back, it gets wider and wider and wider. So, you know, I thought rather than just leave that up to your imaginations, that we just illustrate that here in the boat. And then I'm going to show you how we actually fix this too. All right, so you can see right here, if you look closely, that we're good all the way up to about here. And then it just starts to widen out on us, right? So if I had cut this about, 2.5 inches back this way, it would have been perfect. All right, but I went past that and I cut here, and you can see that it's really wide there now. So what we're gonna have to do is, after we fit all of this, don't try to sand all this down, because you will put a big hole in your boat, and that will be a problem. So don't try to fix a problem by making another problem. Don't try to sand all this out. Just look at where you should have cut it, and that's where you sand to. Right? So in this case, I would have been right down about here somewhere. So I only sand so that it fits right up to about here. All this is going to get backfilled with epoxy. Not a big deal. It'll just disappear. It's not that big a deal. Okay, but we fit this the same way, and you can actually see this one here. We drew the lines down both sides already, and it's nice and flush all the way down. Okay? All right, I'm gonna start mixing some epoxy, and let's get this stuff on the boat and get some of these gaps filled. Okay, so this operation here requires us to make some filler. And we're going to use sifted wood flour and clear epoxy. So you mix the epoxy just like we will for all the other projects on this boat. For our particular epoxy, it's 1/2 to 1, which basically means for every ounce of resin, we do a 1/2 ounce of hardener. Wood flour is an additive which is structural in nature, right? Lots of different kinds of additives. There's micro balloons and different kinds of fillers and additives, but when we want to do structural stuff, particularly glues, we want to use wood flour because it tends to have the most staying power. All right, so depending on what project you're doing, you use different amounts and different thicknesses and change the viscosity of what's going on here. So we're going to make this kind of like a yogurt. Not quite a peanut butter, just kind of a yogurt. The other thing that wood flour does is it fills gaps. So if you've got small gaps underneath your stem pieces, this will go ahead and fill them right up for you. Now in preparing your stems for this, as you saw, our stem is in pretty good shape. The one on the boat, that is. So we've already, gone and filled up any problems that we've had there, let it dry, sanded it all down, so that we have a nice flat surface. You don't have to do that. I recommend it. It's one of those things you can do anytime after you finish stripping up past the stem. Okay, we're pretty darn close here. I think this is what we're going to go with. All right, let's get over to the boat. So I realize like yogurt is not a very scientific term, but I'm hoping you get the idea here. It'll drip, but it's not running like water. All right, so much like when we did our laminations, we're going to go ahead and spread this out. You don't want to starve it, but you don't want to put way too much on there either, because you just end up cleaning it up. So I know I didn't explicitly say it, but remember to take that screw out down there if you're going to be gluing this over the top of it. It'll make your life a lot easier. And again, these stem pieces should be all cleaned up and ready to go, because it's a lot easier to clean them up now than after they're glued to the boat. Now, if all goes well, just like when we did the laminations for these stem pieces, you should get a nice clean ooze coming out the sides to clean up. So once you get that ooze out the side there, just take your gloved finger and roll right up. Yeah. One of the other reasons that you want to make sure that you pre-drill these is when you go to actually put it on and glue it on, the screw should find the original hole so that you're not guessing as you're gluing it on. Yeah, and as always, when working with epoxy, the more you clean up now, the less you sand off later. so even though some of those gaps, most of those gaps are 1/64 of an inch or so, you want to try to, if it doesn't sand out, you want to try to take care of it, because as you're doing the epoxying to put your fiberglass cloth on, if epoxy gets down in there, it cures by heat, and it creates its own heat. And once the epoxy gets down in there, if it finds a hole or some kind of a void, it'll actually bubble up and it'll make bubbles in your cloth, and you don't want that to happen. So if it doesn't look like it's going to sand out, go ahead and fill it in. All right, we're just adding a little bit more wood flour now to make it thicker so that it doesn't want to run. And we're going to take care of that stem that we were talking about. All right, so we've made the epoxy now about the consistency of a fillet so that it won't run around on us. And then you just backfill it. And again, because we're using wood flour as the filler, it will have some structural integrity there. And it won't be quite so brittle and break on you. Don't be afraid to use your gloved hand and shape it the way you want it. And just clean up. Now, there's every possibility in the world that you're not going to get this in one shot, and that you may have to come back and do a little bit more filling later. But you want to try to get this a little bit hefty, a little bit high, because what's going to happen here is we still need to shape this outer stem. And we're going to do that with sanders and rasps or whatever you feel comfortable with doing that operation. But we're going to get this down so that this stem blends right into the boat. And it comes, I'm going to do mine so that it comes up to a nice rounded point at the end. And it'll be beautiful. Okay, so that's it. That's how you backfill that in case you cut too far back. And again, this all looks much worse than it is. Most of these gaps are almost imperceptible, but again, better to take care of any gaps that you might have now. And we'll take care of this with at most 120 grit, and probably in my case 220 grit. So because you can see how this brings out the swirls. The swirls are definitely there, and we want to get rid of all that. So we'll sand all this down, and we'll get ready to put some fiberglass cloth on this thing. Getting close to flipping this thing over.